On July 31st of 2007, a mother of four was getting divorced with her husband when she decided that she was going to enact the most sinister revenge on him humanly possible. This is the sinister case of Mary Ann Wittich. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also trying to avoid running into people I know out in public. This disguise should work.
Hey, Joel, is that you?
Dang it! But anyways, today we're going over the case of Mary Ann Wittich, a soccer mom who did such horrendous things to her children that it's genuinely hard to talk about. For our story, we're heading to Delhi Township, Ohio. Delhi Township is one of the 12 townships of Hamilton County, and it's right near the Ohio-Kentucky border. With a population of around 30,000 residents, it's got a real small town feel to it, and is overall a tight-knit community filled with good people. If you ever find yourself in the area, here's a short list of things to do. You can head over to the Delhi Park filled with sports fields, a skate park, and a pond. You could stop by the American Sign Museum and browse through a bunch of different, unique, and interesting looking signs. You could visit the Delhi Historical Society and learn all about the unique history of the township. You can even dance your way over to Jocko's Pub, a place that hosts live musical performances every weekend. But unfortunately, despite how entertaining all of these activities might sound, not a single one of them is the real reason as to why we're in Delhi today. Mary Ann Beckenhaupt Wittich was born on November 28th of 1962 to her parents Jim and Joyce Beckenhaupt. While very little information is publicly available about her life other than her heinous crimes, there are a few things that we do know. First of all, in 1983, she got married to a man by the name of John Scott Wittich, who went by the name of Scott. Second, the couple had 4 kids together from the mid-1980s to the year 2000, with the oldest being Katie, the second oldest being Lindsay, and the 2 youngest being Jacob and his little sister Sydney. And lastly, by the mid-2000s, the entire Wittich family was living in a typical suburban home in a calm neighborhood in Delhi Township. Now, according to friends and family from the outside, Mary Ann appeared to be a very loving mother, and she even coached one of the kids' soccer teams. In the years leading up to 2007, she returned to school to start the process of becoming a nurse. And by the time the events that I'm going to explain to you pretty soon happened, Mary Ann had already completed nursing school and was about ready to take her official examination. But despite all of these facts, not all was fine and dandy in the Wittich house. Also, in the years leading up to 2007, Mary Ann and her husband Scott were having extremely bad marital issues. Some of this most likely stemmed from the fact that Mary Ann suffered from terrible mood swings and emotional turbulence. One day, she could be really happy. The next day, she might be miserable. But in addition to these issues, Mary Ann's husband soon learned that she was having an affair with another man. Upon learning this, it created a sharp divide between Mary Ann and Scott, so much that in 2006, Mary Ann told a friend that she was considering jumping off of a bridge. And in December of that same year, she bought a handgun. Then in January of 2007, this tension reached a boiling point when Scott officially filed for divorce with his wife after 24 years of marriage. After this, the couple agreed on joint custody of their youngest children, and Scott Wittich moved out and then relocated to a home in Highland Park, Ohio. Meanwhile, the oldest children had already grown to be adults by this point and were currently living at the family's home. But the problem with the custody agreement involving the youngest children, at least in Mary Ann's eyes, was that she didn't really want her husband to have any involvement in raising them. So pretty soon, she became deeply resentful. Ironically though, Scott Wittich absolutely adored the youngest members of his family, and by all accounts was a good father and a good person. And the children that were caught in the middle of this well, they were good too. Really good. The 10-year-old Jacob Scott Wittich was the only boy among the 4 siblings and a talented soccer player. Everyone who knew him liked him tremendously, and he was highly intelligent, yet a bit shy around others. Frequently, Jacob teased his older sisters and found joy in playing video games with his friends. In addition, he was very protective over his family, but no one was he more protective over than his little sister Sydney. Sydney Wittich was the youngest of the family at 7 years old and a glowing ball of pure joy. According to the people that knew her best, she was very sassy and witty for her age, and she loved Disney princesses. She also made friends very easily, and every now and again she'd make her family laugh by imitating her older sisters and blurting out curse words. A quirk that she never really got in big trouble for, simply because it was part of her larger-than-life character. But unfortunately, before long, Sydney and her brother Jacob were about to be involved in something terrible. Something that had all the makings of a sinister revenge plot initiated by their own mother. Now, around the same time Mary Ann and Scott Wittich were getting divorced, Mary Ann was now dating a new man by the name of Michael. While it's not 100% clear how the two of them met, Mary Ann and Michael were already making plans to get married a few months after her divorce was finalized. In fact, during a trip to Gatlinburg, Tennessee together, Mary Ann spoke to Michael about having a wedding in the woods. And they also took a look at some possible wedding rings while they were at a jewelry shop in town. But almost ominously, this trip was cut short by the sudden death of Mary Ann's ex-husband Scott's father. And afterwards, things just really started to unravel in Mary Ann's mind. On July 27th of 2007, Mary Ann went to her first target practice using the gun she had bought the year prior. Strangely enough, before this, no one, not even her lover Michael, knew that she owned a weapon. But after getting acquainted with how to use it, Mary Ann then sent a series of different notes and calls to various friends and family. And it's pretty clear, by this point, her plans were already being set in motion. Some of the recipients of the messages included her brother, her sister, and her parents. Now, while most of these seemed more like thank you letters rather than farewell letters, during one strange phone call with her brother Jim, Mary Ann did provide him with specifics about what to do with her share of the family's farm in the event of her possible death. Obviously, Jim found this to be a bit weird, but he never could have anticipated what would happen next. On July 31st of 2007, Mary Ann woke up ready to commit an unbelievably cruel atrocity. The moment she got out of bed, she had all of her plans laid out and was already finished making the necessary preparations. But before that could happen, she needed to say one last farewell to her lover Michael. So early in the morning, Mary Ann drove over to Michael's house located in Crescent Springs, Kentucky, right across the Ohio-Kentucky border. When she got there, she woke up Michael in his bed at around 5:30 in the morning. And despite not expecting this visit, the two of them spoke for a bit. According to Michael, Mary Ann appeared to be unusually calm. After he got up to get ready for work, though, she quickly said goodbye to him, exited the house, and got back into her car. Next, she returned to her home in Delhi Township. At this point, her 2 eldest daughters were about to head off to work. According to her daughter, Lindsay, as Lindsay was in her bedroom getting ready, Mary Ann made a comment to her from outside in the hallway, jokingly asking her if she was ever going to leave for work. But at the time, she didn't really think too much of it. When the 2 eldest daughters, Katie and Lindsay, were finally leaving for their respective jobs a little before 10 in the morning, Lindsay says that her young siblings were both hanging near the computer, with Jacob being the one actually on it, while Sydney was busy watching him over his shoulder, still in pajamas. After the 2 daughters had left the home, though, Mary Ann was now free to continue with her devious plan. The following sequence of events is then what authorities believe to have taken place from 10 to 11 a.m. First, Mary Ann told the kids that she had to go out and run some errands. Afterwards, she got into the car, drove up to a nearby PNC bank, and deposited $10,690.69 into her boyfriend Michael's account, the bulk of which was transferred from her account to his. Then, on the way home, she stopped by a Wendy's to get Jacob and Sydney some chicken nuggets and fries, along with a drink for herself. For some reason, though, she was evidently here 2 times in the span of 10 minutes. So either she wanted more food or they got the order wrong. Whatever it was, after this, she drove back to the family's house. By this point, the mood in the home, as far as the children were concerned, was still very casual. According to evidence, a bowl of popcorn sat on the floor of the family's living room, the TV was set to Disney Channel, and the PlayStation had a game called Jake's Locker Room playing. Finally, over the duration of the next few hours, something absolutely terrible happened to the 2 children. But before I outline the horrendous details, let's go over how the Wittich family themselves learned about this awful tragedy. So shortly after 11 a.m., Jim Beckenhaupt, Mary Ann's father and the grandfather of her 4 children, stopped by the home to drop something off. But when he got there, he called out to no response. He then went near the outside of Mary Ann's bedroom and saw Jacob's hand draped over the bed. And according to Jim, he just figured that they were all still sleeping. So after that, he left, thinking nothing of it. Less than 30 minutes later, the house received a phone call from Scott Wittich, who was trying to get in contact with Mary Ann. He wanted to talk to her about picking up the kids later as part of their joint custody agreement. However, nobody picked up the phone on the other end. Throughout the next several hours, Scott tried calling the house 8 more times, but never received a response. Shortly after 5 p.m., he then drove from his new residence in Highland Park to the family's house in Delhi Township. While driving past the house, he saw his daughter Lindsay opening up the garage door to enter the home. But instead of stopping right away, he continued cruising a little further up the street and decided to wait for a minute before picking up the kids. That way, he may have been able to avoid having to see his ex-wife. And unfortunately, he was able to avoid seeing her for the time being, but not for the reasons he would have ever imagined. Shortly after making his way up the street, he received a frantic phone call from his daughter Lindsay with heartbreaking news. She immediately cried out to him, "They're dead! They're dead! Everybody is dead! Come here!" Meanwhile, in the family's home, Scott's second oldest daughter Lindsay was now in tears, holding the body of her youngest sibling, Sydney. Now, only a few minutes before all of this, Lindsay had just gotten home from her nearby job at a grocery store, and she was ready to sit back and relax for a bit. However, after entering the garage and not seeing anyone on the first floor, she began casually walking up the steps. After she had reached the top of the steps and was then strolling through the hallway, she peered into her mother's bedroom and saw her brother Jacob lying on the bed. At first, she thought he looked a bit strange, but upon entering the room, she approached her 10-year-old brother and noticed blood on the sheets he was lying on. Quickly, she realized he was dead. And once she looked around the room, she finally noticed that her little sister Sydney was lying on the same bed and her mother was on the floor below, both of them deceased as well. Right away, July 31st became the worst day of her entire life. It was so devastating that shortly after, the entire family regrouped at the family's home, saw the scene, and contacted the authorities. Lindsay was placed in an ambulance while her sister Katie collapsed on a neighbor's lawn. Fortunately, these events were just from stress, but once the authorities arrived, it became their job to piece together exactly what happened and why. Much of the information the authorities uncovered we already talked about, but now let's discuss what occurred the moment Mary Ann returned home after going out to run some so-called errands. So as you'll likely remember, Mary Ann had driven to Wendy's to get the children some food. After arriving back at the family's home, her and the 2 children all ate lunch together. Then she somehow persuaded the 2 of them to head upstairs and lay down with her in her bed. Now originally, it was reported that the children were placed under the influence of an over-the-counter sleep medication, but this has since been disputed by a more detailed coroner's report. essentially meaning that the children were wide awake during the time Mary Ann was doing all of this. But anyways, at some point shortly after having the children laid down, she lifted both of their shirts and used a permanent marker to draw an X where their hearts were located. While this was something she had a considerable degree of knowledge of because of her education as a nurse, she also used a stethoscope in order to make sure she had the right spots. Around the same time as this, she placed a few notes for her eldest daughters to read later on top of a nearby dresser. Next up was the final part of her deranged and meticulous plan. Mary Ann got out the gun she had recently learned how to shoot, and after firing it in the hearts of both of her children, she directed the muzzle inward at her own heart and fired for one last time. And that was the end of 3 human lives. A completely senseless tragedy conducted for no reason. And although one neighbor nearby, by the name of Travis, did claim to hear a gunshot when all of this was ongoing, it wasn't until the eldest daughter Lindsay came home and the authorities arrived that everyone found out. But with Mary Ann Wittich now dead, there was no one alive to hold accountable for her terrible crimes. So the end of this story doesn't conclude with anyone being put in prison or being put on death row. And if any real justice is being served, it's happening on the other side. However, that's not to say that the rest of the surviving Wittich family just gave up on doing anything at all. In fact, in the years since, they've done something incredible. Only a little over 12 months after this senseless tragedy occurred, Scott Wittich and his 2 oldest daughters got together and agreed to create a foundation fully dedicated to preserving the memory of Sydney and Jacob. The foundation is called From Our Angels to Yours, and it does a lot of good work around the greater Cincinnati, Ohio area. This includes raising money for various charities such as the Ronald McDonald House, which houses sick children, the Pro Kids organization, which helps trains volunteers to speak up for neglected kids, the St. Dominic School Scholarship Fund, and various different local individuals and families who are in desperate need of financial help. All of the people involved truly believe in what they're doing, and it's well organized and properly maintained. Now, unfortunately, Scott Wittich did just recently pass away about a year ago at the age of 58, but before that, he was able to finish his life in an inspiring way, doing a lot of work for charity and even getting remarried. Overall, the case of Mary Ann Wittich is extremely tragic, and it's tough to imagine how anyone could do such a thing to their own kids. I hope Sydney, Jacob, and Scott are all resting peacefully. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please subscribe and hit the like button because that's all we do. I also have a second account with my brother named Horrifying where we tell stories about everything paranormal. This includes true crime, mysteries, and things that are just downright spooky. I'd greatly appreciate if you subscribe to that too. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.